Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neal Bellon.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. This is going to be our Season 8 finale. I'm going to be taking an extended end-of-year break, and I will be back with Season 9 in January of 2025. So if you're new to the podcast, if you're just discovering us, this is a great time to binge on what you missed, and then you'll be all caught up. Before we get to this week's content about our discussion of chess teaching, let's jump into our listener mailbag, where we're going to discuss the response to episode 130 a few weeks ago about online chess cheating.
You've got mail.
We're going to start with some responses from our Long Island Chess Club Facebook page. So some of our regulars chimed in. First was a comment from National Master Nick Panico, who has been on the podcast more than once. He says, "The question that nobody to date has answered, including Kramnik, is how the programming is being done to have an engine play for a human account at certain phases of the game. What type of programming code are they using? Maybe Tim Mirabile can help with this. I'm referencing Tim, not because he's a cheater, but because he knows a good amount of computer technology and maybe can shed some light onto this." So for those who don't know, Tim Mirabile, also a national master, he's the assistant director of the Long Island Chess Club, a good friend. He was the first guest on this podcast. And here is Tim's reply to Nick. He says, "Automated cheating has to be very rare. The vast majority of cheaters are using low-tech methods of manually relaying engine moves. Unless a programmer is allowing large numbers of people to download a cheating tool, most players will not have the ability to code one themselves, at least for a web-based site." I tend to agree with Tim. I mean, I think Nick is right in that there could be bots out there, but most people are simply cheating, presumably, by just looking at their phone or a second device. Because basically, it's kind of the worst kept secret that if you have a chess engine running on the same device that you're playing on, like for example, if you have chess.com on your desktop computer and the engine is also running on that same computer, the servers like chess.com, I believe, I don't want to give you wrong information, but I believe that part of their software is that they can detect that when you have an engine running on the same device that's running chess.com. But if, say, you have the game on your desktop, but then you're using your phone or a tablet to run the engine, if it's a separate device, then it's not so easy to detect. And that's probably how most people presumably are cheating. They basically have the game on their tablet or their laptop or their computer, and then they have an engine running on their phone, or vice versa. Our next comment is from one of our regular followers on YouTube, at bluefin.64, who also gave the suggestion for this two-part episode about chess teaching, or the idea from it was inspired by a comment that he made. And here is what at bluefin.64 writes about the chess cheating. He says, "After Magnus accused Hans, I spent too much time learning about cheat detection. Because of it, I basically trust what chess.com says about the rate of cheating. This is not to say I agree with the actions taken by them against Hans, but I think that more than actual cheating, the bigger problem now is rampant false accusations. Kramnik is currently going after Daniel Naroditsky, who has little to gain by cheating and an enormous amount to lose by comparison. Of course, it's possible, but accusations made by individuals are impressions that are subject to confirmation bias, and Naroditsky cheating makes little sense. I think the team of full-time professionals with relevant expertise at chess.com are likely to be far more reliable. both in not flagging Danya and about cheating on their server generally. I definitely agree with you that Naroditsky was not cheating. I doubt that very much. But I do believe the people who run the online chess sites are, I don't know if I want to say in denial, but I don't agree with them that the rate of cheating isn't as high as many of us think. They seem to be downplaying it. I believe they're concerned about it. I spoke about this in the episode, but I think it's a higher percentage than they're letting on. Now, interestingly, I was listening to something the other day. Grandmaster Jesse Cry, who we all know and love, he thinks that once you get a rating of 2,000 on chess.com, that about 50% of those players are cheating. 50%. I mean, if I heard him correctly, that's what he said. So basically, what he's saying is anyone rated 2,000 or above on chess.com, like once you're in that field, about half of those players are cheating, according to Jesse Cry, if I heard him correctly. And I'm not so sure that he's wrong. I mean, I estimated that for chess.com in general, regardless of rating, that it's probably, about 15 to 20% of players who are cheating. That's probably a conservative figure. It might be more. I mean, people who say, oh yeah, it's only like 3 or 4% of players online who are cheating. That's absurd. It's definitely more than that. But when Jesse Cry made that comment, very interesting, something to think about. I think he was basing that on the games of one of his students. And now we will go to some emails I received. Our first message is from Chad. He said, hey, Neal, wanted to give a shout out for your recent episode and to add a name to your list. And he's referring to the nicknames that I gave for the types of cheaters out there using alliteration. And this is what Chad writes. He continues, this is something that is unique to daily games online, but it is one I have frequently run into, Sammy Siesta. What Sammy does is, as his time to make a move is about to run out, he puts his account in vacation mode. This causes all his games to be put on pause and the clock stops. Then what often happens is that Sammy will return from his vacation the next day or even hours later to make his move. In the worst example of this, I once had an opponent take 6 separate vacations over the course of a single game. Thanks again for the pod. Your episodes continue to help break up my early morning Sunday shifts. Best wishes, Chad. P.S. If anyone out there ever encounters Sammy, you can report players on chess.com for stalling. This may be similar to pressing the button at traffic crossings to get the light to change, but you can at least try that. Well, thanks so much, Chad. I appreciate it. And yeah, you're talking about daily games. Very interesting. I don't really play too many daily games, but the fact that they can do this whole vacation mode thing, yeah, that's kind of disturbing. So I appreciate you chiming in. Our next email is from Lawrence. He says, hi, Neal. I am a longtime listener and appreciate all the content you have been making for us to enjoy and grow. I wanted to add one possibility when it comes to the topic of online cheating. I hypothesize that at least 3 times over the past year, I have encountered players who did not actually cheat, but are much better than their rating indicates. I think the kids call this smurfing. By definition, smurfing is when someone creates a new account to play against lower rated players or has multiple accounts. The times that I think this happened to me was when I began playing longer games, 30 plus minutes. These players don't play the best moves, but they play really well in complicated positions. During these games, I have lost on time while my position became increasingly dim over the course of the game. I found myself out of time while my opponent had only used 10 to 15 minutes of their clock. I have reviewed these games with 2 friends who are higher rated than me, and both commented independently that my opponents played above their rating. Twice, when I looked at their profile on chess.com, they had played many unrated games against opponents, so their rating had not changed in weeks or months. Of course, I find this frustrating, but at the same time, 2 of these games were some of my best chess, at least feeling like I held my own as best I could. I played with no blunders and a lot of good moves. While I am not sure smurfing is cheating, it is frustrating for us lower-rated players who are trying to break 1,000 or other novice milestones. Anyway, it's something to consider. Thanks again for your dedicated hard work. Lawrence. Well, Lawrence, I really appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, that's exactly what smurfing is. You're correct. When you create a new account to play against players less skilled than you, that's not just a chess term. Smurfing is for online gaming in general. And I'm sure it does happen. I think you're spot on. So I appreciate your email. I'm now going to continue my discussion on chess teaching. This is part 2 of 2. Last week was part 1, where I discussed more philosophy and administrative things and how to get students and just some kind of overall remarks. This week, we'll talk about the types of things you actually teach in the lessons, and it'll be kind of an extension of last week's episode. But I think this week we're going to get a little more specific, a little more into the weeds. So some general remarks up front. When you have a student, the main focus should be on analyzing the student's games and their thought process. That's how you're going to identify their mistakes. So to be clear, when you're taking a lesson, when you're giving a lesson, the student will learn more from analyzing their games with you than anything else. That should be the focal point of the lessons, because by looking at the games, you're covering the big picture, so to speak, not just their thought process, but individual moves. You really need to look at their games and not just study principles in the abstract. Now, I want to make a note on openings. Unless they're playing something truly unsound, and I know that even chess coaches who are much higher rated and much more talented than myself agree with this. So unless they're playing something truly unsound, I don't really mess with their opening choices too much, even if it's an opening I'm not crazy about, because at this level, as long as it's basically sound and you're getting to a playable middle game, they're good to go. So I focus more on general opening principles, development, controlling the center, that development is not just moving a piece off its original square. It should have a purpose. It should work in harmony with the other pieces that are already developed, that type of thing. But I will say this is where I do sort of want to have, not some control, but one thing I'll insist on. The student needs to have a consistent opening repertoire that they like, and that will get them playable middle games on a regular basis. I don't push my own personal opening choices on the students. Unless they ask about it, I'm not going to be like, okay, you have to play the London as white. I mean, if they want to learn about it, fine, and if they're already playing it, but I don't push my own repertoire. I don't say, okay, against E4, you have to play the French defense, that type of thing. So if they come to me with a set of openings that they're using already and they like them, I'll say, that's fine, stick with those. Those are all sound, but we may just need to improve on your knowledge of those openings. Make sure that you understand the themes and that you're not just memorizing moves. Also, another general remark. Not everyone who wants chess lessons is a tournament player. That's very, very important. I've had many hobbyists, when I was teaching privately, many hobbyists who just wanted to develop a better understanding of the game, a better appreciation of the game, just for themselves, like for intrinsic reasons or for aesthetic reasons. There are many players who just have no interest in tournaments. This is true for adults and students. There are many adult hobbyists, but even a lot of parents for their kids, they just want it because they know that it helps students in school, and studies show that learning chess can help with critical thinking in other areas. They just want it to be a part of their children's lives. And they're not really concerned about tournaments or that, their precious little one is going to be the next Bobby Fischer. They just want their child to be exposed to the game and learn about it. And they have no interest in playing in tournaments. Same thing with adults. I've had adults who just say, I'm trying to study on my own and I just feel like I'm going nowhere. I just want to have a better understanding of the game just to develop my skills for myself. Keep in mind that that's true, because the thinking sometimes, the narrative is sometimes, well, you only take chess lessons if you're a tournament player. Absolutely not true. There are many people, again, adults and children, who take chess lessons. They have zero interest in playing in tournaments, okay, which might be a smart thing. But anyway, something to be aware of. And for your students who are tournament players, this is one of the differences if you're teaching a tournament player versus a hobbyist. You do need to cover the chess psychology and tournament conditions aspect of it. Because what happens is some people do very well away from the tournament hall, but then once they're at an actual over-the-board tournament and you're dealing with a chess clock and writing down the moves and touch move and an intimidating opponent sitting across from you, it kind of changes people. So that's something that you need to kind of work on with your students who are tournament players. Now, another thing I do, another general remark, anyone taking lessons with me, surprise, surprise, has to read The Amateur's Mind as sort of a side project. And then we can discuss it in the lessons as needed if they want. What I basically tell them, it's kind of like if you take a college class and they say, okay, here's the main syllabus. You're going to see your week-to-week assignments, but by the end of the semester, I need you to read this book on your own, that type of thing. That's what I do with The Amateur's Mind. I basically say, the one thing I'm going to insist on, you need to buy this book and just read it at your own pace. If it takes you weeks, months, however long to get through it, but if you really want to develop as a player, you need to read this book from cover to cover. So that is one thing I do. That's no surprise if you've been listening to this podcast. And then, of course, with your students, you have to assign study material. It can't just be, okay, here's the lesson, great, see you next week, adios. They need a study plan. They need things to work on if they want to get better. Now, that being said, I've had students, let's take adults and children separately. I've had adults who say, look, honestly, I just kind of want to get a better understanding of the game. And I know that I will increase exponentially if I also study, but it's just not something I want to do or I'm busy. I'm okay just taking the lessons. I've had more than one adult say that to me. I've also had more than one parent say to me, well, my son or my daughter is involved in a lot of different things. They enjoy the lessons. I like having the lessons for them, but I think the study material is going to be too overwhelming for them because of all the homework that they get and other activities. And I'm okay just paying for the lessons. And, I explain this to them and they're like, look, I'm okay just paying for the lessons. I completely understand that they need to study as well if they're going to get better, but they have too much going on. I'm all right with it. Some people want that. Now, I explain to the students who are more serious, the ones who are more tournament players and who are concerned about rating and who aren't really hobbyists, I tell them, I say, look, if you really want to boost your rating and get better, you have to study as well and you have to play as well. You just can't take lessons with someone, whoever it is, once a week or once every other week and get better just from that. I mean, you might get a little better just from that, but you have to apply those things in an actual setting by playing and studying. So for the students that you do give a study plan to, the ones who agree that, yes, they need to do that, study plans should be individual. But one thing I've noticed is that when adult developing players come to me for the first time, they generally all have a lot in common. They know how the pieces move. They know what check is. They know what checkmate is. They know the scholar's mate, which is the 4-move mate, but they're still hanging pieces and they need to work with basic tactics, and they generally have zero strategic or positional knowledge. That's all very typical. And speaking of the 4-move mate, since I mentioned it, you need to teach that to all of your students, especially kids, because not that you want them to use that. You don't want to teach them to try to mate their opponent in 4 moves, but their opponents are going to try to them all the time. Like when I had kids and they were playing in tournaments, I told them, you need to be aware of the scholar's mate. I go, I want you to play real chess. Don't do it yourself. But I go, your opponents are going to try this on you. In fact, most of your opponents are going to try. And then that's what happens. If they're a beginner in like whatever, the under 1,000 section, almost every other opponent they have tries the 4-move mate. So your student needs to know it more for defensive purposes because, again, their opponents are going to try to do it to them on a regular basis. And then the last thing, as far as general remarks, I touched on this a little bit already. You have to make clear to the student or the parent, if it's a child, no student is going to improve, at least, not by leaps and bounds anyway, just by taking lessons. A lot of people think that, oh, I'm taking lessons now, like boom, like magic, their rating's going to shoot up. That's only part of it. You got to play a lot. You got to study a lot. You got to do the work. Simply just meeting someone for lessons once a week, that will give you some improvement, sure, but you're not going to improve by leaps and bounds just because you're taking a lesson once a week. That's part of the bigger picture, but it's not the whole picture itself. We're now going to take a short break, and we'll be back to continue this discussion starting with some essential concepts that all beginning and developing students need to know. We'll be right back. So what do chess students need to know? What are the essential concepts? I think I'm covering almost everything here. This is not a definitive list. This is not Bible, but I think this is a pretty good general overview of the essential principles that a student needs to know. If you are someone in that developing phase, don't get overwhelmed by this. It'll all come. But these are things, if you're taking lessons over a period of time, your coach needs to cover this at some point or assign exercises or books or courses that cover this stuff. As far as actual study materials and what I use in the lesson, we're going to get to that in the next segment. So what are some of the essential concepts? Well, first and foremost, general board vision and not hanging pieces or missing hanging pieces that you can take. So when I say don't hang a piece, that goes two ways. You don't want to leave a piece that your opponent can take, but if your opponent hangs a piece, you don't want to miss it, right? If he hung his knight and you didn't see it, you got to fix that. So that's general board vision and not hanging pieces, those real gross elementary blunders. You need to clean that up because that's the first step before you get into some more advanced tactical things and positional things. You have to stop the gross elementary blunders like hanging pieces, hanging mate in one, things like that. Next thing, you have to know all the basic checkmates with the heavy pieces. King and queen versus king, king and rook versus king and two rooks versus king, all that stuff. Don't worry about the bishop and knight mate. Now, my opinion, like chess coaches who say, oh, you have to teach the bishop and knight mate, they can go fly a kite. You may go your entire chess career and never even have an opportunity to do it. Most people won't. I wouldn't worry about the bishop and knight mate. Now, I know the argument is, oh yeah, but even if you never use it, it teaches, the coordination of the pieces. I think it's a waste of time, bishop and knight mate. I'm in that camp for that. Okay. You could do that as a later time when you get more advanced. I wouldn't worry about it. And then you also want to teach things going back to the mates with the heavy pieces like king and rook versus king, all that. Like, for example, with king and queen versus king, it ends up being generally a support mate where the queen checks the king, but your king supports the queen, right? So his king can't take it. But then what a lot of students do, they try to do a support mate with the rook, right? But a rook cannot mate the king with a support mate, right? Because the rook doesn't cover the diagonals. The king can shift over. With a rook, it has to be the type of thing where it's on the edge of the board and the king has the opposition. So these are things that beginning players struggle with. So all those basic mates with the heavy pieces, very important. You also need to learn all the basic mating patterns. The back rank mate, Anastasia's mate, the Epaulette's mate, Scholar's mate, all those different patterns. You pick up any tactical book or any checkmating book, it's all in there, but they need to know those. Like the smothered mate with the knight, all that stuff. The student should do lots of mate in one and mate in two exercises. Very important when they're starting out. They have to sense those checkmate patterns. That'll help them both with offense and defense. They have to know what stalemate is. Very important concept because a lot of beginners, it'll be king and queen versus king. And you'd be surprised, especially with kids, how many times it'll end up in a stalemate. All right, because they don't know how to do the mate properly. Okay, so stalemate, very important concept. And of course, next thing, all the basic tactical themes. Pins, forks, skewers, overloaded piece, removal of the guard, X-ray attacks, all that stuff. You started out on a very basic level, but they need to know all that because that's how they're going to win games. All the basic tactical themes, very, very important. And then as they develop those ideas, you also want to add some 3-move combinations, right? Like you move, he moves, you move, he moves, you move, that type of thing. Like 3-move combinations where you're taking those tactical themes on a little bit of a higher level. You want to cover all the basic opening principles. I'm not necessarily talking about specific openings, but whatever openings you work with, they have to know the basic opening principles about development and controlling the center, Generally, you want to castle as soon as possible, that type of thing. Now, I understand like some people are going to say, yeah, but what about something like the advanced variation of the French defense where the center is closed? Sometimes you're better off not castling. Right. You'll explain that as you go. But in the beginning, they need to understand, generally speaking, 99% of the time, you are going to want to castle, develop your pieces, don't start a premature attack. All the basic opening principles. Don't move the same piece twice unless there's a reason to do that. Yeah. Now, yes, there are times when it does make sense to move the same piece twice, that type of thing. Don't move your queen too early, all these things, but I get it in certain lines of the Nimzo Indian defense. White goes queen c2, but then you would have to explain that that's actually a very safe square for the queen. And the reason is that you're controlling squares. These are all different things that you're going to get to in bits and pieces. Next thing would be all your basic middle game and positional ideas, right? This is where you get into like Silman and the imbalances, although that's not the only way to look at the middle game, but it happens to be my favorite way. When we say middle game and positional ideas, minor pieces, the battle of the minor pieces, really, your knights and bishop versus your opponent's knights and bishop, pawn structure, space, initiative, king safety, files and squares, backward pawns, doubled pawns, things like that. Things like rooks belong on an open file, knights prefer closed positions, and then as you get more advanced, you can talk about how the pieces coordinate. Like, for example, one thing a lot of beginners aren't aware of until it's too late, the queen and the knight, they form a lethal attacking combination. If you can attack your opponent's king, if your opponent's king is vulnerable and you can attack with a queen and a knight, that is often deadly because what happens is it either leads to mate or either some type of tactical shot in the win of material. Now, some people they know on some level that the queen and the knight work really well together and that they're nasty, but they don't really understand why. The reason is each piece has powers that the other does not, so they complement each other very well. That's why the queen and knight work so well together. And I mean, I've had some games where if I was able to activate my queen and knight and attack my opponent's king, that's just nasty, nasty stuff. All right, so things like that. And then let's talk about the end game. Basic end game ideas. You want to start, obviously, with all the king and pawn versus king theory, which, as Jeremy Silman and others have said, that's like 50% of all endgame knowledge. So if you know king and pawn versus king and the opposition, the square of the pawn, triangulation, outflanking, that whole thing, you're like halfway there. But other concepts like rooks belong behind passed pawns, different types of passed pawn tactics, where you can sometimes sack a pawn to queen another pawn, or you could even sack a piece to queen a pawn, right? Because in the end game, once the pawns get past the 5th rank and there's a passed pawn, that can get pretty scary. There's usually a lot of tactics involved. You want to go over the basics of rook and pawn endings, which are very, very difficult. The basics of opposite colored bishop endings. Another favorite of mine, you'll get to not right away, but is a queen, like king and queen versus king and pawn on the 7th. In other words, you have the king and queen, but your opponent has a pawn on the 7th and he's about to get a queen himself. And the trick there, of course, is you check your opponent's king with your queen in such a way that you force him to step in front of the pawn on the queening square. And then when his king is on the queening square, that's when you move your king closer. Then he pops his king out, you check again, you force his king back on the queening square, and then you move your king up again. And then eventually what happens is your king and queen wins the pawn and checkmates his king. Like things like that, they have to know. That was a mouthful. That was a lot of information, may have seemed overwhelming, but these are some different things that you have to go over. And obviously, you're not going to go through all this in one lesson. This is going to take time, baby steps, one thing at a time. But those are some of the most important concepts that players need to know. Now let's talk about what materials I use. What do I use in the lesson? And what do I use when I assign them homework and study material? Now, I actually keep things simple here. It's not like I have a list of like 50 different resources that I use. There's really no need for that. So, of course, in the lessons, as I mentioned earlier, the students' games are what's going to be most important. They're going to learn more from that than anything else. I'll sometimes look at my games from the club as well, especially if there was a lot going on and a lot of back and forth, or I can show, the typical type of amateur moves and amateur mistakes that happen. But the students' games are going to be a major part of the lesson. The other resource that I use both in the lesson and for homework, this is my absolute favorite. You could almost argue that this is a one and done because it's so thorough, are the chess.com lessons. Not the videos, not the puzzles, the lesson library. I've said this several times on the podcast. I'm sorry to sound like a broken record. Those lessons on chess.com are a treasure, and I think they are underutilized. Everybody goes on chess.com and just plays bullet for 3 hours. Those chess.com lessons are awesome. All right, that's an unsolicited endorsement, okay? I'm not, they're not like sponsoring me or anything, okay? But they're so good. I mean, I was using them, as I've mentioned on the pod before, back when it was called Chess Mentor, before chess.com was a thing. It was called Chess Mentor. It was these CD-ROMs that came out, and now they became the chess.com lessons because everything's online. Nobody uses CD-ROMs anymore. It's a huge resource for all phases of the game, and regardless of your level, whether you're a beginner, whether you're rated 1200, 1500, 2200, there's stuff on chess.com for everybody. Those lessons are phenomenal. And that really is my go-to, both for positions for study for the lesson and for their homework as well. And then my secondary go-to would be Chessable as far as digital material. But just looking at chess.com's lessons, I have some things that I bookmark here. So what you do is on chess.com, you go to learn and then lesson library. And some of these are just fantastic. The Art of Exchanging Pieces. And now I'm going back to some of the classic ones when I had them on CD-ROM. Build Your Technique by Thomas Wolski. Pawn Endings, Beginning to Expert. Rook and Other Endgames. Endings, Openings, A Taste of the Middle. Chess Potpourri. You got Silman's Lessons in Strategy. Roots of Positional Understanding. The tactics ones are great. I believe there's a beginning tactic one. I don't have it saved, but I'm looking right now. Intermediate tactics, step up in tactics. Everything's on there. These chess.com lessons are phenomenal. You know me, I'm careful about putting numbers on things, but let's say you want to get to like 1500 or 1600 or even just 1400. Everything's on there on the chess.com lessons for you to do that. If you want to get to 1800 even, everything is on the chess.com lessons that you need to know. I mean, it's a fantastic resource. For digital content, that's pretty much all I use because it's all in there. And I like that also because this way I'm not overwhelmed. The student isn't overwhelmed as well. It's not like I'm giving them, 15 different websites to go on. The chess.com lessons are great. Now, as far as books, here are some books that I use in the lessons. Practical Chess Exercises by Ray Chang is excellent because he doesn't give any clue. It's simply white to move, black to move. That's it. You don't know if it's a tactical shot. You don't know if it's a defensive move, if it's a positional thing. You have no idea. And the problem, as I've said before, like with a lot of these tactical exercises, if you know it's a tactic like white to move and win or white to move and mate in one, you know what you're going to look for because it's a hint. It's a huge hint. It's like they did half the work for you. With practical chess exercises, you don't know if it's tactical, positional, or whatever it is, defensive. It's simply white to move. You got to figure out the position and what the best move is. And that will simulate tournament conditions. Okay. The other book I use is The Amateur's Mind. I spoke about that already. And then Yasser Seirawan has a 2-book series, Classic, Winning Chess Tactics, Winning Chess Strategies. Phenomenal books. The Winning Chess Strategies. Say that 10 times fast. Winning Chess Strategies. Winning Chess Strategies. I'm not going to say it 10 times. But anyway, Winning Chess Strategies is an excellent middle game book and has positional ideas. Winning Chess Tactics goes through all the basic tactical themes. You could argue that that's like a one and done book for tactics. For kids, like the Jeff Coakley books, like the Red and Green, those are pretty good. Pandolfini's Endgame course, that is outstanding, especially for lessons, because it's like 1 page per position. It's a great teaching book because the way he teaches the endgame, he covers everything, but it's organized where it's only 1 position and 1 idea per page. So it's great to use in a lesson because you can simply set up the position and it's right there. It's not like 1 position goes on for like 10 pages. So for teaching in the lesson or for assigning things, that's a great book. For teaching, I actually like that better than Silman's Endgame course. Silman's Endgame course, of course, is a great book, but for teaching lessons, Pandolfini's Endgame course, because of the way it's organized, fantastic. And then as far as books, now we're talking about openings now. I know for openings, Chessable is kind of taken over, which is fine, and they are excellent. But as far as books, because some people still like to use a book, the Starting Out series by Everyman Chess, I think is outstanding for whatever opening you want. Starting out the Sicilian, starting out the French. I mean, their Nimzo Indian one and their Queen's Indian one and the French one, for me, has just been life-changing. The Starting Out series by Everyman Chess has been around for years. But what's great is that there is so much explanatory text. It's not just memorizing moves. Those books go out of the way to really make sure you understand the ideas as well. So you could do something like, for the openings that you play, you could get the Starting Out book for it and then get a Chessable course like to supplement it, and you'll be set. So as far as resources, that pretty much covers everything. Between those resources and their own games, you're pretty much set. Now, as far as assigning them materials, like what do I assign them? I spoke about this a little bit. Couple of comments there. As I mentioned, you don't want to overwhelm the students. This is both kids and adults. You're not going to assign them like 20 things to practice. I would give them like 2 things maximum, like do this and this. Start on this chess.com lesson and maybe read the first chapter in this book. Or, do this chess.com lesson for end games, like king and pawn versus king, and then do this one on tactics, like 1 to 2 things. All right. You don't want to overwhelm them. You don't want to say, okay, I want you to do these 2 courses and read the first chapter of this book, because then they're not going to do it. All right. They're going to get like option paralysis. It's going to be too much. Couple of things. That's it. Unless they tell you they're in a situation where they have an inordinate amount of free time or just more free time than most of us do. That's generally not the case, but maybe you're dealing with a retiree who has time, or maybe you're dealing with someone who, he owns his own business, he works from home, he can make his own hours, he has the time to do it. Maybe it's over the summer and you have a student and, he has the time, that type of thing. But generally speaking, most people are going to have a finite amount of time to study. The chess.com lessons are my go-to for digital material as far as covering the building blocks that developing players need. I spoke about that. You also have to emphasize they have to play as much as possible, preferably over the board. That's so important. They're not going to get better just by studying. They have to play. Now, I mentioned the books above as well, but many nowadays, they prefer digital tools so that they can use the Chessable version if they wish, or simply because it's a time saver. For example, if they're away from home and they have their phone or a tablet, obviously they can use the digital study material. They don't have to worry about a board and pieces. And I get that. And a lot of people, understandably, once Chessable comes out and they get a taste of it, they never want to buy a book again. And I get it because like everything is right there on your computer screen. All the variations are there and it's great. So I know I mentioned the books, but if they only want to go digital between Chessable and chess.com, I think that they should be okay. So that was quite a bit of information. That was a mouthful. I know it seems like a lot, but just wanted to share my thoughts and kind of be thorough about the different types of materials that I think are necessary and different things that I use in the lessons. I'm not saying that the list I gave is the only thing out there and that that's quote unquote correct. That's just simply how I do it. Are there other ways to approach this that are just as good? Of course. But I was just kind of sharing. Again, I'm not telling, I'm sharing. So once again, I really appreciate you listening. I appreciate everyone's support of the podcast. I appreciate following us and subscribing. I appreciate all the kind words. I appreciate the 5-star reviews. all the emails. Really appreciate the support of the show. If you're enjoying it, best thing you can do is just tell a friend, leave a 5-star review. It helps us out. And as a reminder, I'm taking an extended end of year break. So it's not goodbye, it's more like see you later. And we'll be back with our awesome 9th season sometime in January of 2025. So I wish you all the best. I know it's a little early when this is coming out, but happy holidays to all of you. Instead of I hope you win your next game, I'm going to say I hope you win your next 10 games. Stay well, stay healthy, God bless, and we'll see you in January. Thanks, everybody.